Okay, welcome everybody. We're doing chapter 18 today, open economy macroeconomics. So what we're talking about is that we're going to be talking about exports mainly and how that affects net capital outflow. So let's get into it. We're talking about international flow of goods and assets. Flow of goods is what we know as net exports, and we'll see that the asset side is more of a net capital outflow. We'll see that in a bit. We'll talk about the real and nominal exchange rate. So that's going to be the exchange rate between currencies, and some concepts around purchasing power parity and so on. So first of all, we know that trade can make everyone better off. So that we're talking about how changes in the trade balance, trade deficits or surpluses, affects the international flow of assets. So how this affects this, and what role does exchange rates play into this whole dynamic. So we've always been talking about closed economies, and we always just assume that net exports equals zero. This economy does not interact with other economies in the world. There's no trade at all. And that just is a simplifying assumptions we use sometimes when we're trying to study other things. But usually we do say that, okay, most economies are open. They interact with other economies around the world. They buy and sell goods and services. And they buy and sell also capital assets, right? So it's not just necessarily trade of goods and services of stuff, but it's also there's a buying and selling of stocks, bonds, and even you can think of this as well as a buying and selling of currencies as well. So we know exports is going to be stuff that we sell, that we produce domestically and sell abroad. Imports are stuff that we buy from abroad. And then net exports is going to be the difference between exports and imports. So NX equals E minus I. Okay, so let's look at a few scenarios. What do you think would happen to US net exports if ABC, A, Canada experiences a recession, falling incomes, rising unemployment? So Canada suddenly experiences a recession. How does that affect US exports? Well, if Canada is having a recession, that means that they're probably not buying a lot of things. And if they're not buying a lot of things, they're not buying a lot of things from the rest of the world, and the US is part of the rest of the world. So if Canada experiences a recession, then US net exports would fall. And the reason being is because Canada is no longer buying Ford trucks or Apple computers or so on and so forth. Okay, and that's because they're having a recession of their own. B, let's look at what happens when US consumers become more patriotic and buy more products made in the USA. Well, if American consumers are buying more stuff produced in the US, well, we know that our imports would fall, right? We have a fall in imports because we're not buying Sony computers anymore. We're not buying stuff from China. We're buying all American stuff, so our imports goes down. And let's not forget that net exports is exports minus imports. So if a fall in imports happen and there's a minus sign in front of it, then US net exports would rise. And that's because the I side went down. Okay, we're importing less. So let's look at this one. This is an important scenario because it shows you how the prices of goods dictate trade flows. So we're going to say here that prices of goods produced in Mexico rise faster than prices of goods produced in the US. So this is saying that prices in Mexico are more expensive than the US. Well, if things are more expensive in Mexico, then American goods are more attractive. I'd like to buy more American goods. So that means that, first of all, I'm not going to buy Mexican goods because they're more expensive. So my imports from Mexico decrease because those are more expensive. But also for Mexicans, American goods are cheaper, right? Because their prices of goods rose faster than in the US. So as a result, from a Mexican perspective, American goods are cheaper, so exports to Mexico increase. Both of these two lead to the same result, which is saying that US net exports increase because Mexicans are buying more American goods and we are buying less of Mexican goods. So that just means in both scenarios, both directions over here, it all leads to an increase in net exports. So if you're ever confused how the effect on net exports is, remember that net exports is E minus I. And here, E increased, so net exports increased. Here, I decreased, but I, there's a negative sign in front of it. Remember, net exports is E minus I. So if a decrease in I happen and I, there's a negative sign in front of it, well, that translates to an increase in net exports as well, just like this exports one did. Okay, so why would we? How do we determine trade flows? A big part of it is just taste, right? Do we want, French cheese, Italian cheese, Swiss cheese? Our taste dictate essentially trade flows, but also relative prices, right? Sometimes if things are too expensive abroad, then we may not buy them, and we may substitute towards domestic goods. A part of this is going to be exchange rates. Exchange rates dictate how expensive things are or cheap. If exchange rates are low, that means that you can buy more of foreign goods, and that may cause you to go and do that. If exchange rates are particularly low, you may increase your consumption of foreign goods. Of course, if your income increases, you may want to trade more. You may want to buy more, French wine or Swiss chocolate, so on and so forth. Transportation costs play a big part. So, the North American Trade Agreement is based on the fact that we're all North America, Mexico, Canada, U.S., and transportation costs is quite low for us being all in the same continent, North America. So because of that, we may want to trade more. And that's a part of that is also government policies. Creating the North American Trade Agreement is a government policy that increased the amount of trade between U.S., Mexico, and Canada. So these are all factors that play a role in determining how net exports is going to look. So if net exports is greater than zero, then our exports are greater than our imports. And that means that we're selling more than we're buying. Okay. If we have a trade deficit, net exports is less than zero, then our imports are greater than our exports. And that means that we're buying more than we're selling. Okay. We're buying more than we're selling because that means that we have a trade deficit. And then balanced trade means exports perfectly equals imports, which never often happens. Look at the US imports and exports over time. You can see since around the 1970s, they were more or less balanced. In fact, we were more of an exporting country in the 60s until the 1970s came along and things structurally changed. Our imports has always been above our exports, and they've even been, it's been a widening gap. You see the gap here is quite small, but then gets larger and larger as time goes on. This gap is the difference between exports and imports, which is our net exports. Okay, so this is important now to start talking about net capital outflow. And net capital outflow is going to be the purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents. Okay, so it's going to be how much of German or Japanese assets did Americans buy from a US perspective, but minus the purchases that Germans and Japanese made of American assets. Okay, so we're going to say that what is going to be the difference in assets, right, between Americans and foreigners, or say the U.S. and any other country. So net capital outflow is a lot like net exports, right? We're trying to figure out how much did we buy, right? How much did we buy minus how much they bought. Okay, purchase of foreign assets minus purchase of domestic assets. Okay, keep in mind if NCO is positive, that means that we bought more foreign assets than the rest of the world bought our assets. And that means that there's a net capital outflow from the US because we're buying these assets. Okay, so let's take a look. NCO measures the imbalance in the country's trade and assets. When NCO is greater than zero, then we have a capital outflow. Domestic purchases of foreign assets exceed foreign purchases of domestic assets. That's exactly what I just said. We're saying that when net capital outflow is greater than zero, that means that we have a capital outflow, and that means that we're buying foreign assets. The net part says, well, we just need to minus out the foreign purchases. But if this is greater than zero, that means that we're buying foreign assets. Likewise, if NCO is less than zero, that means that we have a capital inflow. That means that the rest of the world is buying our assets. Foreign purchases of domestic assets, that's our US assets, exceed our assets of our purchases of their assets. So that means that there's a capital inflow here, that we're selling off a lot of our assets. Okay. So we need to start looking at what affects NCO. And a big part of it is going to be the real interest rates paid on foreign assets, or just paid on any asset. And the idea here is that, well, if the real interest rate paid on foreign asset goes up, then we want to buy more of these foreign assets, right? If the return on German debt goes up from, say, 2% to 7%, well, you're going to say to yourself, I'd like to buy some German debt because it returns such a high return. It used to return 2%, now it returns 7%, and I'd like to go and buy some of that because that's good return. And that means that the changes in real interest rate paid on foreign assets does affect NCO. Right? Same thing for domestic assets. You can say, well, nothing changed in the rest of the world, but now American assets are paying really, really low interest rates. They're really 1 or 2%. As a result, I don't want to buy American assets. I'm going to go and buy something else. So the real interest rate does affect the net capital outflow, but also perceived economic and political risk. I mean, you may know that investment in Africa can be very, very can have an extremely high rate of return, but there's a lot of economic and political risk, and maybe I need to account for that in terms of buying African debt or investing in the developing world. And even some government policies kind of affect who and when you can buy their assets, and that affects NCO as well. So here's an extremely important equality. NCO equals net exports. This happens at every point in time. The reason being is because when a foreigner purchases a good from the US, that means that US exports increases, right? And if US exports increases, that means that the foreigner pays with currency or assets, so the US acquires some foreign assets, causing net capital outflow to rise. The idea here is that if Mexicans buy American assets, they pay with Mexican pesos, and we acquire those Mexican pesos, causing our net capital outflow to rise, meaning that we can use that money in order to make purchases in Mexico, okay? And here, net capital outflow means that we are now purchasing Mexican assets or foreign assets. Why are we purchasing foreign assets? Well, we're doing this because net exports increase. We've gained more money from the rest of the world, and we're going to use that money to buy assets. So when a US citizen buys foreign goods, the opposite happened. Net exports falls, right? Because now we have an increase in imports. As a result, we know that NCO falls. Net exports equals NCO. So if net exports falls, NCO falls. Why does that happen? Well, we now use some of our cash, right? Use some of our dollars, and gave it to the rest of the world because we're importing from them. And as a result, now the rest of the world has some American dollars, and they use those dollars to buy American assets. And as a result, net capital outflow falls. Now that's because the rest of the world has American dollars that they just got from these imports, from the sale of this import, and they use those dollars to now go and buy US assets. Maybe they buy US stocks, maybe they buy US real estate. The point is that they're stuck with US dollars, and they need to purchase something. They need to do something with those dollars. They can purchase capital, right? And that's why net capital outflow falls, because the rest of the world has just purchased some capital from the US using these dollars, and there's a decrease in net capital outflow. Okay, so let's look at an example. We're going to say that Kiara is a web designer in Illinois. She creates and sells a website to Gabrielle, who's living in Germany. Gabrielle pays 5,000 euros for the website. What is the effect on the US net exports and net capital outflows if A, B, C, and D? So A says if Kiara keeps the 5,000 euros at home. Well, if Kiara sold a website to Gabrielle, that means that US net exports increase because we sold a website to Gabrielle. Gabrielle gave us some euros. She gave us euros or dollars? She gave us euros. If she gave us euros, that means that U.S. exports and U.S. exports and net capital outflow both increase, right? Because we know that these two things are equal. So it's an export for the U.S. U.S. exports increase. Now, if she keeps the 5,000 euros at home, right? Well, that means that NCO increases because now we have 5,000 euros in the US. She kept them at home. That means that we have an asset, right? Which is 5,000 euros from Germany. and that we essentially bought from Germany and now is in American soil. So that means that net capital outflow increases here because we've just bought or we've just received some capital from Germany. Now you may think that, well, it's just euros. It's not quite capital like stock or bonds or some asset, but you should think of currency. You should start to think of dollars or euros or any fiat as an asset as well. So just when Chiara we gave her Chiara sent over a website to Gabrielle and she got in return 5,000 euros. Well, that's going to be 5,000 German assets. Just in the form of euros, and as a result, net capital outflow increases. Now, if the same thing happens over here, if we buy 5,000 euros worth of stock, nothing really changes. Net capital outflow still increases. The only thing we've done is that we've exchanged those euros, that currency, into now another type of asset, which is stocks. Those stocks are still worth 5,000 euros, especially at the time that we just bought them. All we've done here is that we've just changed the form of capital. We've changed it from currency, as in example A, into now stocks. And as a result, nothing really changes. NCO is still the same. It's equal to NX. NCO increases. Now we've just kind of changed the form of the capital from currency to stocks. Now, but what if we spend those euros on German shoes? Now, notice German shoes isn't quite an asset. It's more like a consumption. It's kind of like when Gabrielle bought the website from Chiara, as she was hoping to consume that website, or kind of like buy it as an export, as a trade element. Well, this now becomes a trade element too. This says that, well, we took those 5,000 euros, but then we sent them back to Germany and we got some good in return. And you see here the answer at the end says that net exports do not change and NCO does not change. And the idea here is that we sent over a website and they sent over some shoes. And as a result, those two trades canceled each other out perfectly. And as a result, net exports does not change and the NCO does not change because we sent over 5,000 euros worth of websites, they sent over 5,000 euros worth of shoes, and nothing changed. The only difference here in this example is that we actually kept the money. We didn't trade for anything back. And that's why NX increased and NCO increased, whereas here, since there's kind of a two-way trade, it canceled each other out and nothing happened in the end. Now let's assume that that Chiara exchanges the euros into dollars. So that means that this is kind of like example A and B, because she just exchanged those 5,000 euros into dollars, and she gave those 5,000 euros to someone else, to another American that wants to purchase a good or service in euro. So that means that NX equals NCO, just like example A and B. And what essentially happened here is, from a macro perspective, nothing changed. The only thing that changed is that Chiara gave her money to Joey, some other guy in the US economy, and he's holding those euros and she's now holding dollars. From a macro perspective, those 5,000 euros are still in the US, whether it's with Chiara or whether it's with Joey, it doesn't matter. They're still in the US. And that's why we're saying that net exports is going to equal NCO, kind of like in the example of A and B. And the only difference is here, though, those euros just changed hand from one American to another, from Chiara to this new person, Joey. And as a result, nothing really changed. And the change in NX is matched by a change in NCO. The only difference here is that, well, that capital used to be with Chiara, now it's with some other person. But from a macroeconomic perspective, they're all American, so it's still in the US. Okay, let's look at another example. So now we're going to say that Amazon purchases $10 million worth of goods from China to sell to American customers. What is the effect on the US net exports and net capital outflows if A, B, or C? All right, A says China buys $10 million worth of US government bonds. Okay, well, first of all, for example, if China buys $10 million worth of government bonds, we know that net capital outflows will decrease immediately, because you can say that here, well, China just bought some bonds from US companies. That means that there's a decrease in net capital outflow because Chinese are now buying American bonds. But you can also look at it from the NX perspective, right? We know that the $10 million worth of goods bought from China increases our imports, which decreases our net exports. So if we just bought $10 million worth of goods from China, that means we sent over $10 million over to China, and that means our net exports decreased. But by the same token, we know net capital outflow decreased because now the Chinese have $10 million in their bank account. They're going to use that $10 million to buy American assets. They're going to go and buy, well, it's actually, in fact, it's already an asset, right? The cash can be viewed as an asset, but let's assume that they go and they buy American stocks, they go and they buy American bonds, like they did in this case. It's just changing one type of asset to another type of asset. They're just changing currency to bonds and stocks. Still all assets, and nothing has really changed. Okay, but don't forget that fundamentally what sparked this is that we sent over $10 million worth of to get some goods and services from China. That means that imports increased, net exports decreased, and if net exports decreased, then net capital outflow decreased. And the idea here is that because now Chinese have $10 million and they can go and and that's a capital outflow. What if China buys $10 million worth of goods from the US? Well, that's kind of like the example where we bought German shoes, where net exports do not change, NCO does not change because they sent us $10 million worth of goods, and we sent them $10 million worth of goods. So imports increase by the same amount that exports increase. So as a result, net exports doesn't change. We send them over $10 million worth of stuff. They send us $10 million worth of stuff. Net exports is unchanged. NCO is also unchanged. Okay. So any country with a trade surplus means that NX is greater than 0, net exports is greater than 0. That means that they're selling more goods and services than foreigners are buying from them. That means that they have foreign capital, right? That means that they have foreign currency from the other countries that they sold stuff to, and they're going to use that currency to buy foreign assets. So that means that capital is flowing out of the country. NCO is greater than 0. Okay, and the reason here is because, well, this country is running a trade surplus. They're getting all this money from all these other countries, and they're going to use that money to buy capital. They're going to buy capital from Mexico, from Japan, from the rest of the world, because they have a trade surplus. The other token is going to say, well, if NX is less than 0, that means that they have a trade deficit. That means that this country, let's say the US, is buying more goods and services from foreigners. That means that NX is less than 0. That means that NCO is less than 0. That means that capital is flowing into the country. That means that if net exports is less than 0, that means that they're financing this exports, right? The purchase of stuff by selling assets, right? They're selling assets abroad, and that's how they're financing the purchases of these net exports. And this is the example of the US. We're saying that US net exports is less than 0. That means that the US must be selling some of their assets to finance those net exports. So here's a way that you can kind of look at it more concretely. We know that in an open economy, we're going to add this NX part. A closed economy would have taken this NX part and said, hey, output is either consumption, investment, or government spending. But now we've got an open economy, so we're saying that this economy now can trade. So there's this NX element, okay? We also saw that national saving is going to equal to Y minus C minus G. Why? Well, we're saying that, well, you produce some output Y, you've consumed some of it, the government spent some of it, and what's left from that is going to be your national saving, okay? We know that Y minus C minus G is equal to I plus NX. So if you just take the C and put it over there, you put the G and you take it over there, and you leave I over NX over here, that's going to equal this. So this equation came from over here, right? And then we also said, well, hey, well, if Y minus C minus G is equal to savings, then I can come up with this equation right here. And we can say that saving is equal to investment plus net exports, okay? And this is saying that, well, you save some money, right? And you can either put it into two places. You can put it into your investment, or you can put it into your net exports, all right? By the same token, we can say that we know that net exports equals NCO. So we can kind of rearrange this equation to say S equals I plus NCO. And this is saying that your saving is going to equal your domestic investment plus net capital outflow. Now think about it this way. That means that a country, say the US, produces some output, Y, consumes some of it, the government consumes some of it, and what's left over is going to be our saving. Now, with that saving, I can do two things. I can invest it into the domestic economy, and that's this I right here. But let's say that I don't want to invest it in the domestic economy, and I want to go buy foreign assets. I want to go buy German debt. I want to go buy Japanese stocks or stuff like that, and that's going to be this element right here. So this equation is really important because it says that your national saving you can put into domestic or foreign investment. This is going to be in terms of actual investment, real investment, where you have a real asset. This is more of a financial investment, where you kind of just buy stocks or bonds. Okay, so we know that when a company has a trade surplus, that means that exports is greater than imports, and NX is greater than 0. That means that Y is greater than domestic spending. That's greater than C plus I plus G. If NX is greater than 0, then NCO is greater than 0. That means that saving is greater than investment. Because we know that S equals I plus NCO, and if NCO is greater than 0, then saving is greater than investment. Now, the way that you can think about this is we're saying that, hey, if S is greater than I, that means that there must be some of the saving that's not going into I and going somewhere else, because saving is greater than I. Where is it going? Well, it must be going into NCO. That means that we must be taking some of our money and buying foreign assets with it. If S is less than I, if our savings is less than investment, well, how are we investing with more money than we actually have saved? We must be selling some of our American assets. NCO must be less than 0 to finance this investment. If we don't have enough money to cover our investment, if saving is less than investment, well, where is that money coming from? Well, we must be selling some American debt, American bonds, or some capital that's going out to the rest of the world, and we're getting money in return and financing our investment that way. Okay, so here we have an example of that. We see US investment and saving, and you can see that NCO was around 0 for a really, really long time. You can see that I and S were kind of very close to each other. The difference between investment and saving is going to be our net capital outflow. And you can see here there's not much difference, showing that net capital outflow is around 0 up until around the 80s, where investment started to be a lot higher than savings. And that's why NCO became negative. Why? Well, if our investment, look in this example here, if investment is higher than saving, well, where are we getting the extra money from? We saved this much, but we invested this much. So where's the extra coming from? Well, we must have sold some domestic assets. We must have sold some domestic stocks, bonds, real estate, whatever, to raise that money that we needed. And once we raise that money that we needed, that's going to be this part, right? That's the money that we raised. We can now put that into our investment. So that means that we have some money that we saved, but then we also raised some financing from selling American bonds or stocks. And that's why this NCO is negative, because there was a negative net capital outflow, meaning that we sold assets. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here for now, and we'll pick it up in the next video.